Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today we are diving into the art of painting patterns and how to avoid the common pitfalls that can make your patterns read three-dimensional when you need them to read flat. So flatness is a very interesting topic. I paint in acrylic, so over the years I've gotten many comments, people saying I can't do acrylic because it looks flat, XYZ. And why I'm bringing this up and why I think it's relevant is because flatness, when it isn't something you can control, is definitely a negative thing. But as a painter, being able to control how flat or how dimensional something is a really important tool to have in your tool belt. That's why today I'm going to break down what I call hierarchy of visual interest. It sounds a little dry, but I promise. Once you understand this key paradigm in which to navigate two-dimensional painting. So the problem most people have when they're painting something like a page out of a magazine or a background that has like a pattern on it, or in this case, like a piece of fabric that I'm using as background, is that it can read really three-dimensional in a way that can feel uncanny or distracting. And we want our fabric, our pattern in this case, to read as though it is a background. And the way I do this is by really sticking to this hierarchy. So even though a still life is not that deep, you don't see way into the distance like you would a landscape, for example, you can use, and you can see on the screen, background having low contrast, low chroma, and no detail, all the way up to foreground having high contrast, high saturation, and lots of details to help orient your painting. And so low contrast, what that means is basically it's not going to be super light next to super dark. Your value is going to be really kind of wedged in the middle. Your chroma, that means how bright and saturated and colorful it is going to be very low compared to the midground and certainly the foreground. And then your detail is going to be much, much less. We're transitioning to oil paint. This is mixed media. And I think I want to talk a little bit about detail because detail is really the main mode that we're navigating, creating that flatness of pattern as opposed to my objects. So my objects are these two swan figurines, this bowl, and of course these apricots. And you have a couple of different ways you can navigate this. You can really push the amount of detail and development and how much information you're putting into the objects. And then by contrast, keep the pattern much less detailed. And that's sort of what I use here. And you can see that even when you look at the reference photo, the flowers are flat, right? They're not super three-dimensional. We do have like some folds where there's little ripples in the fabric. I'm going to underdevelop those. Again, keeping with that hierarchy, because my fabric is operating as background, and yes, it does jut into the foreground because it's the entire background and it's also surfacing as like a tablecloth. Because that can be a little confusing. You're like, well, isn't it background, midground? We're treating it as though it is entirely background with everything except for the chroma in the foreground. And so what it means is you're just knocking your fabric or anything two-dimensional. So if you have like a book and it has like a really elaborate color in it in the still life, same principle applies here. We're just underrepresenting the detail in contrast to the actual subject matter. So the apricots are going to be super fleshed out and the details in the fabric are going to be way undercooked, and especially the fabric in the background, right? And we're doing this to make sure two things. One, that the fabric reads flatter. So there's less detail, less contrast, a little bit less chroma, especially in the background, to a lesser degree in the foreground. And by sort of sticking to that hierarchy, we're creating that illusion of sort of two-dimensionality within a painting. It is two-dimensional, but we're creating the illusion of three-dimensional. It's a little bit of like a head game, right? What does this all mean? I mean, that's the trick of painting. That's why painting isn't easy, at least not for me. It's taken many years because you're trying to represent something three-dimensional with a surface of paint. That therein lies the, conundrum of painting. So let's take, for example, the flowers in the foreground on the pattern. I see quite a bit more wrinkling and texture and variation, but I am choosing, in order to keep that reading flat, to under render both the contrast and the detail so that it stays flat. Now you can always, as you develop this, let's say I get to a point where I'm painting these figurines and these apricots hyper realistically, I can always get to a point where then I can make the fabric more detailed, but it has to always be flatter and less detailed and less contrasty than my subject matter. And the only exception to this rule of that visual hierarchy, hopefully you screenshotted it earlier, is that the fabric in the very most foreground, so up where the two little rogue apricots are, that's going to be quite a bit brighter. For example, when I mixed out some of my colors, the color of the green leaves, the orange flowers, the pink middle, it's much, much more muted in the background, and it's much more high chroma in the foreground. And even though there's quite a bit of variation, I'm sticking with the lower contrast, so I'm summarizing a lot of those colors by sort of rounding them down and making them more simple. And so by making those simple and then pushing my subjects, my objects that are, again, the apricots, the bowl, the swans, it's going to push those in two different directions. And that contrast of how detailed I'm painting everything, the fabric's flat, the apricots and the figurines are detailed, is going to be what creates that illusion of fabric. Now, some other tips, tricks, ideas here are also paint application and blending. I'm going in and applying the paint a little flatter, a little smoother. I might build up some form on these apricots. Certainly I build up the form, the highlights on the swan, but I'm choosing to sort of brush in more softly the fabric. Now, I would argue that this isn't an exception to my rule or anything, that this is just really doubling down on keeping the contrast low. When you have big brushy impasto marks on your painting, it does read high contrast. And so I'm just kind of continuing that, but I'm doing it with not only my color choices, but also with my paint application. And another thing I did was take a soft hog hair brush and soften up the edges of everything that was fabric. So the edge of the white where it meets the orange of the flower and the green, I went and softened it with oil paint so that it had like a smoother, more diffused look to it. And I really leaned into this in the background because, again, that seems like a little trick, but it's actually just doubling down on that hierarchy. I'm lowering the contrast even between the objects printed on the fabric to create that illusion of softness and flatness that's really going to emphasize the fact that this is fabric versus objects, versus the swan figurine, versus the apricots. So to just double down on everything, even though the background has this bright, juicy colors, it really could compete with the objects, but I've softened my edges, I've muted some of the colors in the background, I have lowered the contrast, and I've treated it with much less detail. And because of all of these things, and because, as you can see here in these last few minutes of this painting, I'm really pulling up, rendering, and finding the detail and form in these little swan figurines, that once I hit a certain point of detail, all of a sudden the fabric around it starts to read flatter. And that's because painting is a push and a pull. Everything is contextual. I'm sure you've heard the saying, color is contextual, right? Something that looks orange might look green in another painting because the colors around it. Color is so cool, but it's not just exclusive to color. Even the depth that I'm putting in the fabric versus the objects is going to sort of activate everything around it. By making the fabric flatter, it gives me a better chance to pull some of the form forward in my objects, and by making my objects more defined and found, contrasty, detailed, it's going to create an illusion where my fabric is going to recede further in the background and become flatter with more and more detail. If creating flatness and depth in your painting is something that you struggle with, I recommend writing down that hierarchy, the background, midground, foreground that I had earlier, and maybe taping it to your easel and keeping it as a point of reference, because I had to really push this when I was working on this painting. I'm glad I did, though, because this was a really fun painting. I think I nailed it. Hopefully that was helpful. Y'all can leave comments below, and happy painting.